There are stories that slip through the cracks of history, tales whispered in languages long since faded from common memory, accounts that make historians uncomfortable because they don't fit neatly into the narrative we've been taught. This is one of those stories. Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were being watched in a place where you knew, absolutely knew, you were alone? Drop a comment below and tell me where you were when it happened, because what I'm about to share might make you reconsider what was really watching you that day. This story takes us back to the Appalachian Mountains in the year 1747, to a time when the Cherokee Nation still held dominion over valleys that would later bear names in a language their descendants would be forced to learn. But this isn't a story about the Cherokee themselves. Not exactly. This is a story about what they found in those mountains, about the people who were there before them, and about a trader named Silas Whitlock, who made the mistake of asking too many questions. Silas Whitlock was a man of 34 years, tall and lean in the way of men who spent more time walking than sitting, with a weathered face that bore the marks of countless seasons exposed to wind and sun. His hands were calloused from handling rope and leather, his eyes a pale gray that some said made him look like he was always staring at something far away. He traded in deerskins and furs, traveling between the Cherokee settlements and the colonial outposts along the coast, speaking enough of the Cherokee tongue to conduct business and enough English to sell what he acquired. He wore buckskin like the frontiersmen did, practical and worn, with a broad-brimmed hat that had seen better years. Silas had been making these journeys for nearly a decade, knew the trails as well as any white man could, understood the protocols of trade and the importance of respect when dealing with nations that could end your life with a word if you gave offense. But in all those years, in all those conversations around evening fires and in council houses, he had never heard the Cherokee speak of the moon-eyed people until the autumn of 1747. It started in a settlement near what would later be called the Little Tennessee River, a collection of structures built in the Cherokee way, with a council house at its center where the elders gathered to discuss matters of importance. Silas had arrived with a string of pack horses loaded with iron tools, cloth, and other trade goods the Cherokee valued, prepared to spend several days in negotiation as was customary. The head man of the settlement was a dignified elder named Moytoy, a man of perhaps 60 years whose presence commanded attention without him having to raise his voice, his face lined with the wisdom of decades, his movements deliberate and measured. They conducted their business in the traditional manner, sharing food before discussing trade, speaking of mutual acquaintances and recent events before getting to the matter of deerskins and beaver pelts. It was during one of these evening conversations, after the formal trading had concluded and tongues had been loosened by the satisfaction of fair dealing, that Silas made his error. He mentioned having traveled through a particular valley to the west, a place where the trees grew so thick that midday looked like dusk, and asked if the Cherokee had any settlements there that might be interested in trade. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. The low conversations around the fire ceased. Moytoy's expression, which had been warm and open, became something else entirely. Not angry, not afraid, but watchful in a way that made Silas's instincts scream that he had stepped into something he didn't understand. Moytoy spoke slowly, carefully, asking Silas to describe exactly where he had been, what he had seen. Silas recounted his journey through the valley, the unusual quality of the light filtering through the dense canopy, the way sound seemed to behave strangely there, not echoing the way it should, but instead being absorbed by something he couldn't identify. He mentioned finding what looked like old structures, stone walls that didn't match Cherokee building methods, covered in moss and vines, but unmistakably constructed by human hands. He talked about the feeling of being watched that had followed him through that valley, a sensation so persistent that he had abandoned his planned route and taken a longer path to avoid spending a night there. When he finished, Moitoi was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at the other elders gathered around the fire. Something passed between them, some unspoken communication that Silas couldn't interpret. Finally, Moitoi spoke, and what he said changed the course of Silas's life. He said that Silas had been in the old lands, the places where the moon-eyed people once lived, and that the Cherokee did not go there unless necessity demanded it. When Silas asked who the moon-eyed people were, expecting to hear about some rival tribe or ancient enemy, Moitoi's response was not what he anticipated. The moon-eyed people, Moitoi explained, were here before the Cherokee came to these mountains. They were a pale-skinned people who could not bear the light of day, who built their towns in the deepest valleys and the darkest hollows, who moved only at night, when the moon provided the only illumination their sensitive eyes could tolerate. They were not like other peoples the Cherokee had encountered. They spoke a language that sounded like water moving over stones, built structures that seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than being placed upon it, and possessed knowledge of things beneath the ground that made even the Cherokee elders uneasy. The Cherokee had come to these mountains many generations ago, Moitoi said, and at first they had tried to coexist with the moon-eyed people, had attempted trade and communication, but the moon-eyed people wanted no such relationship. They withdrew deeper into the mountains, into places where the sun never fully penetrated, and they made it clear through actions rather than words that they wished to be left alone. The Cherokee honored this wish mostly, though there were always young warriors who saw the abandoned settlements as challenges, as places to prove their courage. Those who went into the old lands sometimes returned changed, speaking of lights that moved beneath the ground, of sounds that came from stone itself, of presences that watched from darkness so complete that not even the moon could penetrate it. Some never returned at all. The Cherokee learned to mark certain valleys as forbidden, to teach their children that some boundaries existed for good reason, and to pass down the stories of the moon-eyed people as a warning rather than history. Silas listened to all of this with the practiced neutrality of a trader who had heard many strange tales from many different peoples, knowing that belief or disbelief mattered less than respect for the beliefs of those he traded with. But something in Moitoi's voice, in the way the other elders nodded in agreement, in the absolute certainty with which they spoke, made him pay closer attention than he might have otherwise. These were not fanciful stories told to entertain or frighten. These were warnings delivered with the weight of lived experience. Moitoi told him that if he valued his life and his reason, he would not return to that valley, would not investigate those old structures, would not attempt to find the moon-eyed people or their descendants. The Cherokee had learned through bitter experience that some things were better left undisturbed, that some knowledge carried a price too high to pay. Silas thanked him for the warning, said all the right things about respecting Cherokee wisdom, and fully intended to heed the advice he had been given. But intention and action are not always aligned, and curiosity has killed more than cats. And here, friends, we need to pause for just a moment. This story is being brought to you by Behind Dark Tales, and if you're enjoying it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. Also, if you're hearing this on another channel, you should know they've stolen our content without permission. Help us out by reporting them. Now, back to Silas and his terrible curiosity. The winter of 1747 was harsh, even by Appalachian standards, with snows that came early and stayed late, with temperatures that killed livestock and made travel treacherous. Silas spent those months in a colonial settlement on the edge of the frontier, a place called Cherokee Station, where traders and trappers gathered to wait out the worst of the season. It was there, in the long dark evenings with nothing to do but drink and tell stories, that Silas made his second mistake. He mentioned the moon-eyed people to a group of traders, recounting what Moytoy had told him with the casual tone of someone sharing an interesting anecdote rather than a warning. The reaction was not what he expected. Most of the traders laughed, dismissing it as Cherokee superstition. But one man did not laugh. His name was Jedediah Ashmore, a trapper of perhaps 40 years, with skin like worn leather and eyes that never seemed to blink quite often enough, who had spent the better part of 2 decades in the deeper mountains hunting beaver and living more like the Cherokee than the colonists he had been born among. Jedediah waited until the others had lost interest in the conversation. Then he pulled Silas aside and told him something that made the trader's blood run cold. Jedediah said he had seen them, the moon-eyed people, or at least he had seen something that matched the description the Cherokee gave. It was during a winter much like this one, he explained, when he had taken shelter in a cave to escape a blizzard that came up suddenly and viciously. The cave went deeper than he expected, opening into chambers that showed signs of having been worked by hand, walls too smooth to be natural, passages too regular to be the product of water and time. He had gone deeper, drawn by curiosity and by the strange quality of the air in those passages, a coolness that didn't feel like the cold of winter, but rather like the chill of something that had never known warmth. That's when he saw the light, a pale glow that seemed to come from the stone itself, moving through passages too narrow for him to follow. He heard sounds too, voices, or something like voices, speaking in tones that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He had fled that cave, Jedediah said, fled like a man pursued by demons, and he had never gone back. But he had seen other things in other places, structures and valleys where the trees grew wrong, bent and twisted as if trying to grow away from something. Streams that flowed uphill for short distances before correcting themselves. Places where his compass spun uselessly and where time seemed to behave strangely, where an hour in one location felt like 10 minutes or 10 hours, depending on some quality he couldn't identify. He told Silas that the Cherokee were right to avoid those places, that the moon-eyed people, if they were still out there, were not something a sensible man investigated. Then Jedediah did something that should have been Silas's final warning. He rolled up his left sleeve and showed Silas a mark on his forearm, a pattern of lines that looked like they had been burned into the skin, forming a symbol that hurt to look at directly. He said he had woken up with that mark after spending a night near one of those old structures, that it had appeared without pain or sensation, and that sometimes it still glowed faintly in deep darkness. He advised Silas to forget about the moon-eyed people, to stick to his trading routes and his safe valleys, and to never ever go looking for things that didn't want to be found. Silas should have listened. Any reasonable man would have. But Silas Whitlock, for all his years of successful trading and survival on the frontier, was not entirely reasonable when it came to mysteries. The winter passed slowly, and with each passing week, the story of the moon-eyed people occupied more and more of his thoughts. He told himself it was intellectual curiosity, a trader's instinct for discovering new markets and new opportunities. But if he had been honest with himself, he would have admitted it was something else entirely. It was the need to know, the compulsion that drives men to open doors that should remain closed, to ask questions that should never be answered. When spring finally came in 1748, when the snows melted and the trails became passable again, Silas made preparations for a journey. He told the other traders he was heading to Cherokee territory for the spring trading season, which was true as far as it went. What he didn't mention was that he planned to make a significant detour to return to that valley he had passed through the previous autumn, to investigate those old structures more thoroughly. He packed his supplies carefully, taking more than he would normally carry for a trading expedition. Extra rope, torches, flint and steel, enough food to last 2 weeks in the wilderness. He told himself he was being prudent, but the truth was that he was preparing for something he couldn't quite articulate, some expedition into darkness that his conscious mind refused to fully acknowledge. The journey to the valley took 8 days of hard travel through terrain that seemed determined to discourage his progress. Storms appeared from clear skies. Trails that had been passable became treacherous. His pack horse went lame and had to be left at a Cherokee settlement, where the inhabitants looked at him with expressions that mixed pity and disapproval. He continued on foot, carrying what supplies he could manage, driven by a compulsion that had long since stopped feeling like curiosity and had become something closer to obsession. When he finally reached the valley, it was late afternoon, and the quality of light was exactly as he remembered it. The trees here grew differently than in the surrounding forests, their trunks thicker, their canopies denser, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. The sounds of the forest, the bird calls and insect noises that normally filled the Appalachian wilderness, were muted here, as if the very air absorbed sound before it could travel properly. Silas made camp at the edge of the valley, near a stream that ran clear and cold, but somehow tasted wrong, like water that had passed through stone that had never known sunlight. He built his fire carefully, gathered enough wood to keep it burning through the night, and tried to ignore the feeling that had been growing steadily stronger since he entered the valley. The feeling of being watched. Night fell quickly in that valley, the transition from twilight to darkness happening in what felt like moments rather than the gradual fade he was accustomed to. Silas sat by his fire, listening to the silence beyond the circle of light, and tried to convince himself that this had been a worthwhile journey. Tomorrow he would investigate the structures he had seen, would document them carefully, would perhaps find something of value, or at least something interesting enough to justify the risk he had taken. But as the night deepened and the darkness beyond his fire became absolute, he began to understand what the Cherokee had meant about this place. There was something wrong with the darkness here. It wasn't the simple absence of light that you experienced in a normal forest at night. It was a presence, a thickness to the shadows that made them feel almost solid, as if the darkness itself was a substance that could be touched or measured. His fire seemed smaller than it should be, its light not reaching as far as it ought to, as if the darkness was actively pushing back against the illumination. Have you ever been in a darkness so complete that you could feel it on your skin? That's what I'm talking about. Leave a comment if you've experienced something like this. Because what happened to Silas that night is something I think some of you might understand better than you'd like to admit. The sounds started around midnight, or what Silas judged to be midnight based on his pocket watch. Though he noticed with some alarm that the hands seemed to be moving irregularly, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow. They were not sounds that belonged to any forest he had ever experienced. There were voices, or something like voices, speaking in tones that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than through the air. The language, if it was a language, was unlike anything he had ever heard, a series of resonances and harmonics that made his chest vibrate and his vision blur at the edges. There were other sounds, too. Footsteps, but not the footsteps of animals or humans. These sounded like stone grinding against stone, rhythmic and purposeful, circling his camp at a distance just beyond the reach of his firelight. He threw more wood on the fire, made it as bright as he could, and tried to see what was making those sounds. But the darkness revealed nothing, or rather, it revealed things that made no sense, shapes that might have been figures standing among the trees, but when he looked directly at them, they weren't there, visible only in his peripheral vision. Lights that moved beneath the ground, pale glows that traced patterns through the earth itself as if the soil were transparent. At one point, he saw what looked like a structure in the distance, a building or tower that definitely hadn't been there when he made camp, glowing with that same pale light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. He drew his knife, more for comfort than because he thought it would be any use against whatever was out there, and he waited for dawn with every muscle tensed and ready to run. Dawn, when it finally came, was wrong. The light didn't strengthen gradually the way it should. Instead, the darkness seemed to retreat reluctantly, pulling back in stages, leaving patches of shadow that persisted even as the sun rose above the mountains. Silas examined his camp in the growing light and found things that made his hands shake. There were marks in the ground around his fire, symbols carved or burned into the earth, forming a circle that he was certain hadn't been there when he went to sleep. His supplies had been moved, not ransacked, but rearranged, placed in patterns that suggested some meaning he couldn't interpret. His rope had been tied in knots he didn't recognize, complex weaving that seemed to serve no practical purpose. And most disturbing of all, his journal, where he kept notes on his travels and trade transactions, had been opened to a blank page. On that page, written in a hand that was definitely not his own, using some substance that looked like ash or charcoal, were 3 words in English. You were warned. Silas should have left then, should have gathered what supplies he could carry and run from that valley as fast as his legs would take him. But the structures he had come to investigate were close, less than an hour's walk according to his estimate, and the trader's stubbornness that had gotten him into this situation now kept him committed to seeing it through. He told himself that daylight, such as it was in this perpetually shadowed valley, would make everything safer, would dispel the fears that darkness and isolation had created. He was wrong, but he wouldn't realize just how wrong until it was too late. He gathered his essentials, left most of his supplies at the camp, and began walking toward the location where he remembered seeing the old structures. The forest here was even stranger in daylight than it had been in darkness. The trees grew in configurations that seemed designed rather than natural, forming corridors and chambers that guided his path whether he wanted them to or not. The ground beneath his feet was wrong too level, too smooth, as if it had been worked by hand and then allowed to age until it appeared natural. He found the first structure within half an hour, and the sight of it made him stop and stare in confusion and growing dread. It was a wall, or what remained of a wall, perhaps 8 feet tall and running for 50 yards before disappearing into the hillside as if it had been built into the mountain itself. The construction was unlike anything Silas had seen in Cherokee territory or in the colonial settlements. The stones were fitted together so precisely that he couldn't slide a knife blade between them, no mortar visible, each rock shaped to interlock with its neighbors in a way that spoke of incredible skill and patience. But it was the material itself that was most disturbing. The stone was pale, almost white, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When Silas put his hand on the wall, expecting it to be cold like normal stone, he found that it was warm, almost body temperature, and it vibrated faintly as if something were moving beneath or within it. He followed the wall, documenting it in his mind since his journal remained back at camp, and found that it led to more structures. Buildings, or what had once been buildings, now mostly collapsed but still showing signs of their original purpose. There were what looked like dwelling places, though the dimensions were wrong for human habitation, too low and too wide. There were storage structures with openings that faced downward rather than outward. There were towers or chimneys that descended into the ground rather than rising from it. And everywhere, carved into the pale stone, were symbols that hurt to look at directly, patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of his eye. Silas spent hours exploring those ruins, his initial fear gradually replaced by fascination and a growing realization that he was looking at something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the history of these mountains. The Cherokee had been here for generations, true, but before them had been others. The moon-eyed people, or whatever they had really been, had built a civilization in these valleys, had possessed knowledge and skills that suggested a level of advancement that didn't match the primitive nature of their reported light sensitivity. Unless, Silas thought, that light sensitivity wasn't a weakness, but rather an adaptation to something else entirely. What if the moon-eyed people had lived primarily underground in caves and tunnels, and these surface structures were just the visible portion of something much larger beneath the earth? The thought made him look at the ruins differently, made him notice things he had initially missed. The doorways that seemed to lead nowhere actually angled downward into passages that had been filled in or collapsed. The towers that descended into the ground were actually ventilation shafts for something below. The symbols weren't decoration, but rather markers, signs indicating entrances or warnings or maps of the subterranean world beneath his feet. He found an entrance late in the afternoon, as the perpetual twilight of the valley began its transition to night. It was a passage that led downward at a steep angle, the opening partially concealed by centuries of accumulated debris and vegetation. Silas cleared the entrance carefully, his hands working, while his mind screamed at him to stop, to leave, to get out of this valley while he still could. But the compulsion that had brought him here was stronger than ever now, a need to know that overrode every instinct for self-preservation. The passage was wide enough for him to walk upright, and the walls showed the same precise stonework he had seen in the surface structures. They also showed something else. That pale glow he had seen the night before, faint but unmistakable, emanating from the stone itself without any visible source. It provided just enough illumination to navigate by, a ghostly light that made shadows behave strangely and played tricks with depth perception. Silas lit one of his torches anyway, wanting the comfort of normal firelight, even if it seemed inadequate in this place. He began his descent, telling himself he would just go far enough to see what was down there, to satisfy his curiosity, and then he would return to the surface and leave this valley forever. The passage descended for what felt like miles, though Silas's sense of distance had become unreliable. Time was strange down here, too. His pocket watch had stopped working entirely, the hands frozen at 3:15, regardless of how much he wound it. The temperature remained constant, that cool but not cold sensation that he had felt the night before, as if the earth here maintained its own climate independent of the surface world. The passage branched occasionally, other tunnels splitting off into darkness, but Silas stayed on the main route, following the path that showed the most signs of use and the brightest glow from the stones. He began to notice other things as he descended. The air smelled different down here, not stale as he would have expected, but rather fresh, as if it were being circulated by some mechanism he couldn't identify. There were sounds, too, distant and echoing. That might have been water or wind or something else entirely. And there were signs that this place had been inhabited relatively recently. Marks on the walls that looked fresh, scorch patterns near alcoves that might have held lights or fires, smooth patches on the stone floors that suggested regular traffic. He emerged into a chamber that took his breath away and made him understand, finally and completely, that he had made a terrible mistake in coming here. The chamber was vast, easily 200 feet across and perhaps half that in height, with walls that curved upward to form a dome. But it was the contents of the chamber that made Silas forget to breathe. The entire space was filled with structures, a city in miniature, or perhaps a city at full scale for people smaller than humans. Buildings rose in tiers from the floor, connected by bridges and walkways that seemed to defy gravity, the architecture following principles that made his eyes hurt to follow. And everywhere, that pale glow, brighter here than it had been in the passage, bright enough to see clearly but still somehow failing to fully illuminate the space. The city, if that's what it was, appeared abandoned, but something in the stillness suggested that abandonment was recent, as if the inhabitants had just left, perhaps only moments before Silas arrived. He walked through the streets of that underground city, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his torch seeming pathetic and inadequate in the presence of that pervasive glow. He saw things that made no sense, mechanisms that appeared to move water upward against gravity, gardens, or what had once been gardens, now withered, growing in soil that glowed faintly, structures that seemed designed for purposes he couldn't begin to guess. And he saw writing everywhere carved into every surface, covering walls and floors and the undersides of bridges. The symbols were the same ones he had seen in the surface ruins, but down here they were more elaborate, forming what looked like entire texts or histories or perhaps maps of something beyond his comprehension. In the center of the chamber stood a structure larger than the others, a building or temple or perhaps a palace, with an entrance that faced directly toward the passage Silas had emerged from. Despite every instinct telling him to turn back, to leave this place and never speak of it again, he found himself walking toward that central structure. The entrance was open, a doorway perfectly proportioned for someone perhaps 5 feet tall, leading into darkness that even the glow of the stones didn't penetrate. Silas hesitated at the threshold, his torch raised, peering into the blackness beyond. That's when he heard it. A voice, or something like a voice, speaking in that same language he had heard the night before, the words resonating in his chest and making his vision blur. But this time, impossibly, he understood. Not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them. A warning, a command, a promise. You were warned. You came anyway. Now you will understand. Now you will see. Now you will remember what your kind forgot. Now you will carry the knowledge that should have remained buried. Now you will join those who came before and could not leave. Now you will become part of the deep places. Now you will serve the purpose you were always meant to serve. Silas ran. He dropped his torch and ran. Back through the underground city, back into the passage, scrambling upward with a terror that gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Behind him, or perhaps all around him, he could hear sounds that suggested pursuit. Not footsteps, but something else. A sliding, grinding noise like stone moving against stone, accompanied by that voice or those voices, speaking in harmonics that made the tunnel itself seem to vibrate. The pale glow in the walls grew brighter as he climbed, bright enough to see clearly, but somehow still failing to fully illuminate the passage. He could see shadows moving in the stone itself, shapes that flowed through the rock as if it were water, keeping pace with him, herding him upward toward the surface. He burst out of the passage entrance as full darkness fell on the valley, fell to his knees, gasping for air that tasted impossibly sweet after the strange atmosphere of the tunnels. Behind him, the entrance to the passage had changed. The stones had shifted, sealing the opening, leaving no trace that there had ever been a way down into that underground city. He ran again, not bothering to return to his camp, not caring about his supplies or his journal or anything except getting out of that valley. The darkness here was absolute, but somehow he could see well enough to navigate, as if that pale glow from the tunnels had somehow gotten into his eyes and refused to leave. He made it out of the valley by dawn, though he had no memory of the journey, no recollection of the hours between fleeing the ruins and finding himself on a familiar trail miles away. His clothes were torn, his hands bleeding from climbing or falling or both. his pocket watch still frozen at 3:15. He returned to Keowee Station in a state that made the other traders avoid him, speaking little, sleeping less, spending his nights staring at nothing while his hands traced symbols in the dirt, the same symbols he had seen carved into the stones of that underground city. Jedediah Ashmore found him one evening, took one look at Silas's haunted expression and the mark that had appeared on his left forearm, identical to the one Jedediah carried, and simply nodded, as if confirming something he had always known. He told Silas that it would fade, the compulsion to return, the dreams of those tunnels and that glowing city, the voice that sometimes spoke in the deepest part of the night. But it would never fully leave. That Silas was marked now, the same way Jedediah was marked, the same way others had been marked throughout the years. That the moon-eyed people, or whatever they really were, didn't need to be seen to be present. They were still there, in the deep places, in the tunnels beneath the mountains, waiting with a patience that measured time in centuries rather than years. And sometimes, Jedediah said, they called to those on the surface. Sometimes they showed themselves to those who came looking. Sometimes they marked individuals for purposes that humans couldn't understand and couldn't escape. Silas Whitlock never traded in Cherokee territory again. He moved east, back to the colonial settlements, found work as a clerk in a trading house, where he never had to venture into the wilderness. He married late in life, had no children, told no one about what he had seen in that valley except in a journal he kept hidden, and which was found after his death in 1792. The journal described the underground city in detail, included copies of the symbols he had seen, and contained a warning written in a hand that became increasingly erratic toward the end of his life. The warning said that the moon-eyed people were still down there, still building their cities in the darkness beneath the mountains, still pursuing whatever purpose had brought them to those deep places, that they had been there before the Cherokee, before the people who came before the Cherokee, perhaps before any human had walked these mountains, that they were patient beyond human understanding, and that they were waiting for something. The journal was read by historians who dismissed it as the ravings of a man who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. The symbols were examined by scholars who could find no match for them in any known language. The locations Silas described were investigated by adventurers who found nothing but empty valleys and old ruins that could have been made by any number of ancient peoples. But the Cherokee, when asked about the moon-eyed people, would only shake their heads and say that some stories were not meant to be investigated, that some warnings existed for good reason, that the deep places should remain unexplored. The valley that Silas Whitlock visited still exists, though its exact location has been lost to time and the changes that have reshaped the Appalachian landscape. Hikers sometimes report finding old ruins in places where no maps indicate any settlements, seeing lights that move beneath the ground, hearing sounds that seem to come from stone itself, and sometimes, very rarely, someone will emerge from the mountains with a mark on their forearm that glows faintly in darkness, speaking of cities beneath the earth and voices that call from the deep places. The Cherokee no longer tell the stories of the moon-eyed people to outsiders, having learned that some knowledge attracts exactly the kind of attention that should be avoided. But among themselves, in the old language that fewer and fewer speak with each passing generation, they still pass down the warnings. They still teach their children that some valleys should not be explored, that some ruins should remain undisturbed, that the pale glow sometimes seen in deep caves is a sign to turn back immediately. They say that the moon-eyed people are still down there, still waiting, still building their cities in the endless dark. They say that time means nothing to those who live beneath the mountains, that centuries pass like days in the deep places, and that what seems ancient to humans might be recent to those who measure their existence in epochs rather than years. There are those who study the old stories, who collect the fragments of Cherokee oral tradition and try to piece together the truth of the moon-eyed people. They find contradictions and inconsistencies, different versions of the same events, descriptions that vary from village to village and generation to generation. Some say the moon-eyed people were a pale race that lived in these mountains before being driven out by the Cherokee. Others claim they were not human at all, but rather spirits or beings from some other realm. Still others suggest they were an ancient civilization that chose to retreat underground rather than face the changing world above. The scholars argue and debate, building theories on foundations of myth and speculation. But there are things they cannot explain. The ruins that appear and disappear in valleys where surveying teams swear there was nothing before. The caves that seem to extend far deeper than geology would allow, opening into chambers that defy natural formation. The people who go missing in the mountains, not in the usual ways that hikers get lost or injured, but vanishing completely, leaving no trace, as if the earth simply swallowed them whole. There are the symbols that keep appearing, carved or burned into stone in places where no one admits to having been, matching the patterns that Silas Whitlock copied into his journal 2.5 centuries ago. There are the lights that move beneath the ground, visible to those who know how to look for them, tracing patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. And there are the marked ones, those who carry the signs on their skin, who wake at 3:15 in the morning with absolute certainty, who feel the pull of the mountains in their bones, who hear voices in the deepest darkness speaking in harmonics that make stone vibrate and vision blur. In the modern era, with its satellites and its maps and its certainty that every corner of the earth has been explored and cataloged, there are still places in the Appalachian Mountains that resist definition. Valleys where GPS stops working and compasses spin uselessly. Hillsides where ground-penetrating radar shows impossible voids and chambers that should not exist. Caves that extend far beyond what the geological surveys indicate, opening into spaces that suggest artificial construction, despite being carved from solid bedrock. The government knows about these places, or at least certain branches of the government know, though they speak of them only in classified documents and closed briefings. There have been expeditions, official and unofficial, into the deeper regions. Some return with nothing to show for their efforts, but strange readings on instruments and uneasy feelings among the team members. Others do not return at all, and a very few come back changed, carrying marks they cannot explain and knowledge they cannot or will not share. Speaking in vague terms about cities beneath the mountains and lights that move through stone and voices that echo in frequencies human ears were never meant to perceive. The Cherokee Nation, what remains of it after the forced removals and the cultural genocide and the centuries of oppression, still holds the stories, though they guard them more carefully now. The elders speak among themselves about the old warnings, about the deep places that should remain sealed, about the purpose that the moon-eyed people served and might serve still. They notice when hikers go missing in certain areas, when rescue teams report strange phenomena, when someone emerges from the mountains with that particular look in their eyes that suggests they have seen something that defies ordinary explanation. They do not interfere, having learned long ago that some people will seek the forbidden regardless of warnings. That curiosity and obsession are forces stronger than wisdom or caution. But they remember. They maintain the oral traditions, passing them down to those who will listen, preserving the knowledge that modern scholarship dismisses as superstition. They know that the mountains are old, older than any human civilization, and that they hold secrets that predate human memory. They know that beneath the familiar forests and the mapped trails and the tourist destinations, there are other places, other realms, other purposes being served by presences that do not conform to human understanding of what is possible or impossible. Silas Whitlock's journal, after being dismissed by several generations of historians, was acquired by a private collector in the early 21st century. The collector, whose name is not public record, became fascinated with the symbols Silas had copied, began researching similar patterns in other ancient sites around the world. What they found suggested connections that mainstream archaeology refused to acknowledge. The same symbols, or remarkably similar ones, appearing in caves in Kentucky, in ruins in the American Southwest, in cliff dwellings that dated back thousands of years, in sites that had no apparent connection to each other. The symbols seemed to be a language, but a language that operated on principles different from human writing systems. They conveyed meaning not through the sequence of characters, but through the geometric relationships between them, through the resonances they created when traced or spoken or even thought about in certain ways. The collector attempted to create a key to this language, spent years comparing variations and trying to discern patterns. But the deeper they went into the research, the stranger their behavior became. Colleagues reported that they began speaking in odd cadences, tracing symbols in the air during conversations, claiming to hear voices that no one else could perceive. Eventually, they stopped responding to communications entirely, their last known location being somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, searching for a valley that matched Silas Whitlock's descriptions. The thing about Silas's story, the thing that makes it different from typical frontier tales or indigenous legends or modern urban myths, is the consistency of the details across multiple independent sources. The Cherokee accounts of the Moon-Eyed People, collected by different anthropologists in different time periods, describe essentially the same beings with the same characteristics: the pale skin, the light sensitivity, the underground dwellings, the strange architecture, the incomprehensible language. Silas's journal adds details that he could not have known from Cherokee stories alone. Descriptions of underground chambers and symbols and construction techniques that he witnessed firsthand, and the modern accounts, the hikers and the explorers, and the marked ones who carry the symbols on their skin, they report experiences that align too closely with the historical records to be mere coincidence. They describe the same pale glow in the stones, the same sensation of time moving strangely, the same voices speaking in harmonics, that physical ears should not be able to detect, the same compulsion to go deeper, to see more, to understand what cannot be understood. The pattern suggests either a shared delusion so powerful that it transcends time and culture, or it suggests that there is something real beneath those mountains, something that has been there for a very long time, something that occasionally makes itself known to those who venture too deep into the places where the light does not reach and where time moves according to different rules. There are theories, of course. There are always theories. Some researchers propose that the moon-eyed people were simply a light-skinned tribe, perhaps of European origin, who arrived in the Americas before the commonly accepted timeline of European contact, that they adapted to a nocturnal lifestyle to avoid conflict with other tribes, developed a unique culture and architecture, and eventually died out or were absorbed into other populations. This theory requires ignoring most of the stranger details, dismissing the underground cities and the glowing stones and the impossible architecture as embellishments or misunderstandings. Other theories suggest a connection to ancient civilizations, to visitors from other continents or even other worlds, to lost advanced societies that chose isolation over interaction. These theories embrace the strange details but struggle to provide evidence that satisfies scientific scrutiny. And then there are the theories that scholars refuse to publish, the ones that appear only in private correspondences and anonymous online forums, suggesting that the moon-eyed people were never entirely human to begin with, that they were something else, something that existed in the liminal spaces between our understanding of reality and the deeper truths that underlie it, something that built cities in the dark not because they were driven there, but because that was their natural habitat, their preferred environment, something that measured time in geological epochs and pursued purposes that human minds could barely conceive of, something that is still there, still building, still waiting for whatever it has always been waiting for. The marked ones, those who carry the symbols on their skin, they have their own explanations. They speak, when they speak at all, of having been chosen, of serving a purpose they do not fully understand but cannot refuse. They describe dreams of vast underground spaces, of cities that extend for miles beneath the mountains, of lights that move through stone, and of voices that speak in frequencies that resonate in bone rather than air. They talk about time dilation, about spending what feels like hours or days underground, only to emerge and find that minutes have passed, or vice versa. They mention seeing others down there, other marked ones from different time periods, all serving some function in a system none of them can fully comprehend, and they warn, always, that going into those deep places changes you in ways that cannot be reversed, that once you have seen the cities beneath the mountains, once you have heard the voices in the stone, once you carry the mark on your skin, you belong to something that exists outside the normal flow of time and human understanding. You become part of the deep places, whether you remain on the surface or descend into the darkness. You carry knowledge that should not be carried, purposes that should not be served, connections to things that should remain unknown. The question that haunts researchers, the question that haunted Silas Whitlock until his death, is what the moon-eyed people wanted. Why build cities underground? Why mark certain individuals? Why maintain such a presence across millennia? while avoiding direct contact with surface dwellers. The Cherokee accounts offer no clear answer, suggesting only that the moon-eyed people pursued their own purposes and preferred not to be disturbed in that pursuit. Silas's journal speculates, but reaches no conclusions, his entries becoming increasingly abstract toward the end, as if the very attempt to understand was proving corrosive to normal thought patterns. Modern investigators have proposed everything from mining operations to religious practices to scientific research to preparations for some event that has not yet occurred. But none of these explanations fully account for the evidence, the strange architecture, the impossible stonework, the lights that move through solid rock, the time distortions, the marks that appear on skin, the voices that speak in harmonics beyond human hearing. The answer, if there is an answer, remains hidden in the deep places, guarded by darkness and stone and the accumulated weight of centuries. And perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some knowledge not meant to be acquired. The Cherokee understood this, encoding it in their warnings, teaching their children to respect the boundaries between the world they knew and the worlds they could only glimpse. Silas Whitlock learned it too late, after he had already crossed thresholds that should not have been crossed, after he had already seen things that changed him in ways he could never fully articulate. The marked ones learn it gradually, as the implications of their connection to the deep places become clearer and more disturbing. The pattern is consistent across time. Those who seek the moon-eyed people find something, but what they find is not what they expected, and the finding changes them in ways that remove them from normal human experience. They become liminal beings themselves, existing in the space between surface and depth, between known and unknown, between time as humans experience it and time as it exists, in the deep places where the pale lights glow and the voices echo through stone. The valleys remain, the ruins remain, the passages that descend into darkness remain, though they seal themselves and reveal themselves according to principles that resist human prediction or control. The symbols continue to appear, carved by hands unknown into stone in places where no one admits to having been. The lights move beneath the mountains, visible to those who know how to look for them, tracing patterns that suggest intelligence operating on timescales beyond human comprehension. And sometimes, very rarely, someone emerges from the Appalachian wilderness with a mark on their skin and a story they cannot or will not fully tell. Speaking of cities beneath the earth and voices in the darkness and purposes being served that defy explanation, the Cherokee nod when they hear these stories, recognizing the pattern, offering no solutions or explanations, but only the same warnings they have been giving for generations. Stay out of certain valleys. Avoid the ruins that seem to call to you. If you see a pale glow in deep caves, turn back immediately. If you hear voices that make your chest vibrate and your vision blur, run. And if you wake up with symbols on your skin, symbols that glow faintly in darkness, understand that you have been marked for something, though what that something is may never be fully revealed to you. Silas Whitlock died in 1792, an old man by the standards of his time, still carrying the mark on his left arm, still waking at 3:15 every morning with a certainty he could not explain. His last words, recorded by a nephew who was present at his death, were a warning. He said that the moon-eyed people were not gone, that they had never been gone, that they were still in the deep places doing whatever they had always done. He said that the surface world, the world humans lived in and thought they controlled, was just a thin layer over something much older and much stranger. He said that sometimes the deeper world made itself known, marked individuals, drew them down into the darkness to serve purposes that transcended human understanding. He said that the valleys would always be there. The ruins would always call to those with curious minds. The passages would always open for those determined enough to find them. And he said that those who descended into the deep places would understand, finally and completely, that humanity's place in the world was not what they had been taught, that there were other intelligences, other civilizations, other purposes being served beneath their feet. His nephew dismissed these words as the delusions of a dying mind, but he noted them anyway, adding them to the journal that would eventually make its way into archives and private collections and the hands of researchers who would spend their lives trying to understand what Silas Whitlock had really seen in that valley in 1748. The story does not end with Silas's death. It continues through the marked ones who come after him, through the people who venture into the forbidden valleys despite all warnings, through the researchers who pursue evidence of the moon-eyed people while knowing that the evidence will never be accepted by mainstream scholarship. It continues in the deep places where lights still move through stone and voices still echo in frequencies that make reality feel thin and mutable. It continues in the minds of those who have seen what should not be seen, who carry knowledge that cannot be unlearned, who feel the pull of the mountains in their bones and wake at strange hours with certainty about purposes they cannot articulate. The moon-eyed people, whatever they were or are or will be, remain in the darkness beneath the Appalachian Mountains. They remain in the stories that are still told, though more carefully now, with awareness that some listeners might be drawn to investigate rather than warned away. They remain in the marks that appear on skin, in the symbols that keep being carved into stone, in the valleys where time moves strangely and light behaves in ways that physics cannot explain. And here, at the end of this account, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt called to a place you couldn't explain? Have you ever seen patterns that seem to mean something just beyond your understanding? Have you ever woken in the deepest part of night with absolute certainty about something you have no logical reason to be certain about? If you have, leave a comment below. Tell me about it. Because the thing about these stories, about the moon-eyed people and the deep places and the marked ones who carry symbols on their skin, is that they are not really about the past. They are about boundaries that still exist, about presences that remain active, about purposes being served beneath our feet right now in the darkness we cannot see, in the spaces between what we know and what we can only sense. The Cherokee understood this. Silas Whitlock learned it. The marked ones live with it every day. And perhaps, if you have made it this far in this story, if you have felt that strange pull while listening, that sense of recognition or longing or dread, perhaps you understand it too. Perhaps you have always understood it in a part of yourself that exists outside of rational thought and ordinary experience. Perhaps you are one of those who was always meant to know about the deep places, about what waits there, about the purposes being served by intelligences that measure time and epochs and build cities in darkness. Or perhaps this is just a story, just a tale told to entertain, with no deeper meaning than the simple satisfaction of a mystery that cannot be fully solved. I will leave it to you to decide which interpretation feels more true. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that exist in that uncertain space between history and legend, between documented fact and collective myth, then stay with us for the next account. Until then, think carefully about the mountains you climb, the valleys you explore, the caves you enter. Remember that beneath the familiar surface of the world, there are deeper places, older places, places where time moves differently and where presences pursue purposes we cannot fully understand. Remember that some warnings exist for good reason, that some boundaries should be respected, that some knowledge comes with costs that may be higher than you are prepared to pay. And remember, if you ever find yourself in a place where pale light glows from stone, where voices speak in harmonics that make your chest vibrate, where symbols seem to write themselves into your mind, that you were warned. We all were warned. The question is whether we are wise enough to heed those warnings, or whether curiosity and obsession will drive us, as they drove Silas Whitlock, into depths from which we may never fully return.